Hello everyone, this is Mouse961, and today I'm bringing you the 10th episode of the Warp Drive tutorial series. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the particle accelerator, which is up there and goes over there. To start off, we're going to just cover the basic blocks that are involved with this section. There are quite a few, and they're all fairly the same, just different tiers. The Tier 1 is going to be your basic, Tier 2 is advanced, and Tier 3 is superior, and each of them are for the different stages of the particle accelerator. On the very bottom, you have the electromagnetic glass, you have the plane electromagnet, and up top is the chillers. The glass and the plane blocks can be used interchangeably for the creation of the rings themselves, and the chiller blocks are to cool down the inside of the particle accelerator for that appropriate tier. You can use the incorrect chiller on a different tier, it will just lose efficiency and consume more power. And you see here we have Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. The sizing for that is the Tier 1 is supposed to be approximately 1 chunk by 1 chunk, or a 16 by 16, so you can kind of see it right over there. The Tier 2 is supposed to be 2 by 2 chunks, which is right over there. And lastly, the Tier 3 is 4 chunks by 4 chunks, which is the big green one there. Now, these don't have to be perfect squares. They can be rectangles, so that way you can actually, instead of having this large shape, you could have the Tier 2 go all the way across this edge, and that way you could inject from two sides and not have to actually have two of each of the accelerators. And over here we have void shells. We have both plane and glass. What this does is it actually goes on the inside of the particle accelerator, which is then surrounded by electromagnets. And what happens is the particle bunches actually go inside of the void shells, and that is how it stays safe and doesn't blow up. Without the void shell, the particles will come loose and eventually start causing explosions. Next blocks we're going to look at is the actual control blocks. We have the particle control point, the particle collider, and the particle injector. We'll start with this one wall for now. The particle control point is used on both the collider and any time that you transfer particles from one particle accelerator to another. So if we're going from the small one to the large one, you can see right there above my cursor, there's a particle control point, and that is so that once the particles have enough power, it'll be pushed into the next accelerator to speed up further. The particle collider is used on whichever ring you want to gather the final particles from. So my particle collider is on my big green ring right there, and also that's the setup for it that we'll go over later. And you need 12 of these to have a proper collider setup, and the particle control point goes next to it. And also we have our particle injector. You only need 1 or 2 of these depending on your setup, and what it does is it initially takes any item from Minecraft. Usually I use cobblestone, netherrack, something cheap that is readily accessible. You just toss it on a chest on top of it, and whichever corner it's pointing at is the way it will inject, and I will show you more about that later. And lastly, we have the accelerator controller, which is the brains of the setup, and you can only have one of these per particle accelerator. If you have more than one, it will not work. And, of course, you need power. A whole lot of power. And also, you see the note in the bottom left corner of my screen saying no chiller could be found for this accelerator. That is for this controller right here, because actually behind it I have a small setup, just so that way it doesn't go breaking the server. Okay, now on to the particle collision area, or the particle collider. As you can see here, we just have 3 blocks. It would actually be a full ring, but I didn't feel like making a full ring just for this. So what you do is you have your 3 void shells in the middle, glass or solid. You have your 12 basic, advanced, or superior electromagnets, and then you have 3 of the particle colliders along each side. You then place the accelerator control point directly in the center on the side, and place a chest directly next to it. And in the chest, make sure you have empty electromagnetic cells for the particles to go into. If there are no cells or no chest, it will just spit out the particles, which will then blow up, because particles are explosive. And next, we will talk about the particle transfer system. Here's the Tier 1 accelerator. Just imagine it continues around a big square, and here's the Tier 2 one. It just looks like that. And we have our void shells in the middle. They go across, and then they turn. Because this is the Tier 1 side, we have the control point on the tier 1, so that way when the particles have enough energy, the control point says, hey, you have enough energy, and it pushes it across this beam into the next ring. And how this actually works is you would need a particle injector pointing this way. So if we go up here, you want the particles to go clockwise in this ring, because as they finally get their speed, they'll continue this way, and instead of turning, they'll keep going forward. Whereas if they're going counterclockwise, they'll go forward, hit this wall, and they're not going to turn into this one. That is also important for your injector placement, which you will also see up above. And how the actual block setup works is you have your initial ring, which you can kind of see as the orangish blocks. And then you also have a 3x3x3 completely filled in with the tier that it is going to. So you'll see that I have the advanced electromagnets down here, over there, up top, but these blocks are still the basic electromagnets, and you can't forget the corners. And now we'll head up here and we'll start from the small side. We have our basic chillers on our basic electromagnets, and then what this does is it actually chills down the primary ring to help get things up to speed. We also have a particle injector, which if you look at, it will come forward because the injector goes directly towards the way it's going, and it will go right. And if the energy is not high enough, it will turn right and continue going in the ring again. Once the energy is high enough, it will transfer over to this ring and continue forward. So yes, you have to do some path work with this. And again, we come to another control point. If the power is high enough, it will continue to the tier 3 ring. And here you can better see how the 3x3x3 block works between these two. And yes, there is one single glass void shell, or just void shell, in between the two that does not have electromagnets. So this one will come this way, go all the way down, and it'll go across, whereas that one will head that way. And eventually, they will both work their way over here, spinning around in circles and circles, until they finally have enough power and the collision happens. And you can also change the settings in the computer, which we will do later, and from that you can get either antimatter or strange matter. From the tier 2 you can get protons, and from the tier 1 rings you can get ions. And the ions are required to actually craft some of the tier 2 components, which are the protons, and then I believe the protons are also needed to make the tier 3 components. So you can't just jump straight to tier 3. Also, you'll see that from the tier 1 to the tier 2 and tier 2 to tier 3, there are more chillers. You don't need more chillers, but for the size, I would recommend increasing the amount, because the more chillers you have, the faster your rings will cool down. Also, I have gone ahead and given each of my blocks an individual address. So as I right click, you see the control channel is 8. If I come over here, this one is 7. Everything has to have a separate control channel. And it's good if you can just kind of keep in the back of your head which ones are what, because it allows you to more properly configure what is going on. And now we'll look at the computer. I did place my controller right here, and the computer's just right next to it. The subspace capacitors do have to be on one of the rings, and in this setup you'll see I have a ton of them. That's because it was giving me some issues, so I just threw a bunch of them on there, gave it infinite power. You will have to experiment by yourselves of how much power is required. If there is not enough power, the containment fields will completely break, and the particles will just fly out of the end of the particle accelerator, which is very bad. Because what happens is they are radioactive. The particles themselves are radioactive even inside the shells. So you can't really go near your particle accelerator when it's running, or you will get radiation poisoning. But if the field collapses, the particles will go out the end. So just imagine it's going this way and the field collapses, it'll keep going this way. It'll probably break that block right there, and it'll just keep on going, and if it hits anything along the way, it will cause an explosion and a fire. We actually had that problem in our base a couple times, and even now there's still holes in our base where just particles kept trying to tunnel through the ground. Okay, so back to the computer. It's a fairly easy setup. I'll just hit Control R so you'll see what goes on. It syncs up to everything that's in there. I will press 1. What you'll notice here is that I don't actually have names, but I do know that my collider is number 2, which is set to 130. Anything above 100% for the collider will give you strange matter, or I think it's above 125% is strange matter. And anything below that is antimatter. For the rest of these, they're both control points and my injectors. The injectors percentage, like I believe number 3 is one of my injectors. The percentage doesn't actually do anything for it, so you can just completely ignore it. But the control points, which are on those corners, you can change how much power is required to push from one to the next. By default, everything is set to 95. I don't believe you can go above 100 in the Tier 1 or Tier 2 rings. Some other notes to keep in mind with this is that the accelerated controller must be within 192 blocks of everything else, which means that you can't go more than 192 blocks away from the controller or it loses syncing with the rest of the system. Also, for every injector, you will have 20 bunches of particles in your system. The more bunches you have in your system, the more power is required by your system. So in my setup, I'll actually have 40 bunches of particles going at the same time. If you want to have this working while you're away, you can use a chunk loader, but the controller, which is this block right here, and all the power have to be chunk loaded. Just to keep that in mind. So you can actually wrap the power along the bottom too, so it's more compact and just keep one single chunk loaded, and the entire accelerator will continue to work. Lastly is if you want to make changes to your setup, make sure you turn the setup off first. Anytime you make a change to it, the field will drop, it'll reset, and if there's any particles making a turn at the moment it resets, they will fly off into the distance and hit whatever is in their way. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments below, and I'll be happy to get back to you, and have a great day.